All right, it's 10 o'clock. People are joining in. Hi, this is Adam Asmus. I'm the CEO, founder at Lingoport, and we have two very important guests for you today. The first is Todd Flaska. He runs sales at Lingoport. The second is Brandon Roddey. He runs localization at CNH. He's going to have most of the presentation today, talking about a situation that we find many of our customers are in, that is understaffed for the immense workload that has to be performed. This webinar is coming to you via both Zoom and it's live streamed on LinkedIn. Now, a word about questions. We're going to be taking questions at the end, and it's very important that you familiarize yourself with the Q&A section. Probably you've all seen this for years now, but just in case, there's a little Q&A button on the bottom for Zoom. Type your questions there, please. I always encourage people to write the questions as soon as they occur to one. If you hear something, don't worry about if we answer the question later on in the webinar. Just type it there, and then we can deal with that as we go. It's just nicer to do that when it's fresh in your mind rather than trying to remember that at the end of the webinar. All right, I have just one more announcement. If we can go to the second screen. Brandon, second screen. There we go, great. So I do want to mention and just give a little plug that we're going to have our next webinar in December. We have some very special guests. As you might imagine, we'll be going to be talking about rapid changes in the industry that we see happen both with technology and practices. And we have quite an interesting crew there for you. Marco Trambetti from Translated, Luz Pineda from Motorola, and she's a really good customer. She's always doing neat stuff with her team, and Georg L, I should say, from Phrase, all talking about what's up. As some of you may know, Marco Trambetti announced some very cool stuff with Lara, their LLM specifically for translation. We'll be talking about that and more. And our moderator is going to be the man, the one and only Renato Beninato. So that should be a lot of fun. You'll hear less from me. All right. With that, if there are any questions from me, if you're having a problem, hit the chat button. Questions again in the Q&A. In the chat, there is a registration link. If you forget that, just go to lingoport.com, go to resources, and scroll down to webinars, and you'll see the page there as well. Thank you. And Todd and Brandon, please take it away and introduce yourselves.
All right. Next slide, please, Brandon. All right, so we're going to talk here a little bit today about CNH, and I'm going to introduce Brandon because he's a pretty impressive individual in this space, because he's got both language and language technology, language background, as well as technology background. And this is pretty rare that someone who was a linguist by original trade would go back and study for computer programming and IT. So Brandon has done that, and it's very impressive. I will say it's been a huge asset for him in working at CNH, because there's a lot of different technical groups, and interacting with those technical groups is not easy. You know, they have their own little world in technology, and sometimes going in without the proper, and maybe this is a bad analogy, but the proper shield and sword is a little bit difficult to go into that environment, and Brandon's been able to do that. Lingoport has also helped in that sense. We'll talk about a process audit we helped with, and we're doing some other things with our technology. But that's something that Lingoport can help you with also, is that we're software technologists. We're not translators here at Lingoport. So if having that kind of extra horsepower it would be valuable for you, we're here to help. So anyway, but Brandon's really done an amazing job here with very little resource in CNH, and that's kind of what we're going to talk about today. Next slide.
Yeah. So hello, everyone. Good morning, good afternoon. I'm Brandon, and I am the senior linguistics engineer at CNH Industrial. And I oversee the software localization for the in-cab displays inside of our vehicles, as well as the web and mobile applications that are companion applications for the vehicles that our customers buy. Just a little bit of background about CNH. We are a global manufacturer of heavy agricultural and construction equipment. And so you might have heard of like Case IH, the old Farmall red tractors. That's us. New Holland is another one of our major brands, and our major competitor would be John Deere. And so my role is to make sure that there is language support on these vehicles that are sold in 163 countries around the world. And Todd, do you want to talk about your role at Lingoport?
And just a couple of quick other stats that Brandon just skipped over there. 40,000 employees, 42 manufacturing plants. I mean, this is a very, very large company with worldwide tentacles, one of the largest. So Lingoport, we're focused on software globalization. We're not the same size as CNH. We're a smaller company by quite a bit, but we are very specialized and very focused. We have products and services to help with software globalization. We have Globalizer that many of you may have heard of, which is for internationalization or IATN bug detection. Localyzer is for repo to TMS automation. And then we have services, which is internationalization and localization process improvements through our services organization. We can help rewrite your code in our services group. Next slide.
Yeah, so as Todd mentioned, we're a major industrial group. We have a lot of manufacturing processes, and most of what I do is going to be for embedded devices with a little bit of web technology as well. And when you think about software localization for this type of environment, one of the things that Todd talked about is having this technical background is tremendously helpful for being able to integrate with the teams. The core functions that we do will be more or less the same for any sort of localization or translation project, but being able to integrate with the teams, it does help a lot. And as you'll see in the presentation, even with my expertise, I rely on companies like Lingoport because they've already built a lot of the solutions that are going to really help to accelerate what we're going to talk about here. So just to kind of start this off, I want to use an analogy. Most of us are world travelers. We've gone to conferences, families and friends. I mean, that's how we picked up our different languages. And we know what an airport is. And so if you think about when you come to an airport, there's a series of steps that you have to go through in order to get to your plane and to get to your destination. Most of us probably don't even ask that many questions about it. We know we have to drop off our bags. We know we have to go through security. And all these things have kind of been set up for us when we get there to ensure that we get to where we need to be, hopefully on time, but definitely securely and safely and with all of our baggage. And this, the way I see translations is working with developers is a lot like being an airport manager. And your developers, they come, they want their translations, and it's kind of like baggage. So when developers come to you, you're taking them on a journey, and they need your help to get them to their destination safely and securely with all of their baggage intact. And so if there's one thing you walk away with today, it's this: you are the airport manager, and you need a process to make everything work together. You are responsible for making sure people are following the process. And of course, there's always going to be people who had other ideas about how things might be done. And you're going to have to, talk to those people and bring them on board with what it is that you're trying to do. The other thing that's really important to point out about this analogy is that there's a lot of different teams involved with translation. Most of the time when your internal developers come, they see translations as a one-step process. I hand you some files, you hand me back translations, I send them off to my customer. If that's how you're doing translations today, if you look at this chart, what you'll see is that there's a number of different teams that are involved in the translations process, whether or not they're aware of this. And so, you know, the design phase of software development, there are decisions made that impact whether or not you can translate and manage translations. On the system design of the software, there are decisions made that impact whether or not you can do translation. And this goes for every single one of these teams. And so another part of this airport analogy is the same way you've got these processes, you've got these different services. You need restaurants, you need people to do cleaning. And that's what this is trying to represent. We have a lot of different teams that all are working together for this mission localization that you are responsible for managing. So today, what we're going to talk about is basically at CNH, how did we get to where we are today? You know, how did we go? When I first joined this company, everyone did their own thing. Everyone was using some sort of manual process to manage translations. We didn't have centralized translation memories, and we didn't have good visibility over what software developers were doing. So today, the first part of this conversation, I'm going to tell you about how we set up our processes, and then the second part of the conversation will focus on how we worked with management to drive the changes in the organization that we needed in order to be successful at what we do and get the attention that we needed. So walking into CNH was a lot like thinking about airports. Everyone did their own thing. At some point, the first airports, I would imagine, there was just a tarmac and there were airplanes lined up on the tarmac. Everyone would come up, drop off their bags, climb up the stairs, get on the plane and go. And of course that works until someone gets on the wrong plane, someone drops their bags off in the wrong location, or, someone brings something that they shouldn't on the airplane. And then that becomes a problem to everyone's safety and security. And so that was a lot like what it looked like coming into CNH. What this is showing us here is that basically every software team worked directly with the translation agency, and they would just send their files over to the translation agency, and hopefully they got some files back. At some point, what happened though is people internally said, well, they didn't quite get the words right on the screen, and we want to change the translations to make it say something different. So, an effort was organized. Internal in-country markets and subject matter experts gave their inputs and sent back everything that needed to be changed. The software teams loaded this into the software, distributed the software to everyone, and everyone, clapped, congratulated themselves on a job well done and all the translation bugs that had been fixed. Fast forward to 3 months later, there were changes in the English inside of the software, and so the English files were resent to the translation company. The translation company did their job. They looked up the translations in their translation memory, and they sent back the files to insert into the software. So what happened then was the software was built, and everybody was scandalized. None of the changes that had been made 3 months before were there anymore. And, it was a huge issue with a lot of finger pointing about who was responsible for what. But ultimately, the root cause of the situation was what we're showing you here. The corrections were being made locally in the software repositories and not in the translation memories, the centralized source of truth. And because of this lack of visibility over the processes and this lack of understanding and control of the processes, this situation arose, and it was a very big issue and a lot of time and effort needed to understand what happened and also to correct it. And it jeopardized our software release. This specific release was actually rejected by our overseas markets due to all the regression issues with translations. So what did we do about it? We decided to basically internalize and centralize our linguistic assets in a translation management system. So, we went out to the different suppliers. We selected XTM as the translation system that we would use, and we migrated all of our translation memories and terminology in-house and decided that we would manage looking up the translations in-house using our system before we sent it out to the translation agency. Now, that's a lot of software repos and a lot of different teams and a lot of different language configurations. And so we worked with Lingoport to implement Lingoport Localizer to manage all of the connections and the integration between the software teams and the translation management system. And then lastly, we changed a little bit how we coached developers to work with translation files such that developers don't touch translation files anymore. All the changes to those files are managed by my team, and we put the files into their software repositories where they just consume and ingest what we hand to them. So today that looks like this. We have a centralized system and everything is flowing through Lingoport Localizer, and this is handling the traffic between our translation system and our software developers. And as opposed to what we were doing before, where everyone did their own thing, we now have a streamlined, uniform system that all of our software teams are connecting into, and all of our translation corrections and changes are being made in our centralized source of truth, which ensures that, number one, they're not accidentally deleted or overwritten. Number two, that they are delivered back to the team that requested them. And number three, that they are available for any other team that queries that translation data. So it has this positive cycle effect, virtuous circle effect, that the changes we make are improving our translations generally and not just in one specific location. And with that, I'll hand it over to Todd to talk more about Localizer.
Yeah, thanks, Brandon. So Localizer manages that repo side extremely well. And the way that it does it, it watches the repo continuously. So it's always looking for three things. It's looking for new strings added to existing resource files. It's looking for brand new resource files of the same type. And then it's looking for changes to source strings. All three of those require translation. Those then are queued up, and then they give Brandon visibility as they're being queued up. So as strings are being added, Brandon can see that those strings are there. He can then make decisions. Do I want to send these over for translation now? Do I want to wait? Do I want to batch them up so I'm not hitting minimums? What do I want? How do I want to manage it? But he can see it. He has very precise control and visibility into what's happening with those strings prior to sending them over for translation. There's a dashboard that does that for him. It also does error checking up front. So if there's any problem in the formatting, like if people could key or a problem with the formatting, that is detected immediately. And so the developers can correct that before it goes off and it gets translated into 32 locales and then it breaks 32 locales. So the format checking is very important up front. The whole thing is automated end to end. And as Brendan said, this then allowed him to say, okay, developers, nobody touch the translated files. This is all done by the automation. It all puts it into the repo for you. The beauty of this was a translation timeline improvement from well over 3 months to under 30 days. And that's largely due to Brandon just being able to send things over in a logical sequence that made sense with the right size for the translation company to act on. And some companies may think even 30 days is a long time. I know there's some game companies that are doing multiple releases a day, but this is a big improvement for what Brandon and the company had, and the teams all saw this as a big improvement as well. And then the last thing is it really reduces the developer burden, because developers don't have to think about translations at all anymore. They basically put the source strings in, and then Brandon takes it from there using Localizer and XDM to finalize everything.
Yeah, and just to kind of speak to Todd's point, I'm not sitting in the meetings where all the teams are planning when they're going to put new strings into the software. So for me, this actually gives me ground truth visibility and monitoring into what's happening inside of the software repositories. The way that we were doing things before is the developers would actually wait until their dev done date. So we do 2 to 3 major software releases per year, and the software developers would wait until they were done to hand over everything for translation. So there would be thousands of new text, strings inside of the software to translate. And we were, multiple teams are finishing at the same time, and all of them want their translations at the same time. It was taking 3 to 5 months to get everything done. But with this monitoring system, we actually see when teams are adding new strings. And if 1,000 new strings come in 3 months before that dev done date, we can go ahead and send it out and get it translated. And we keep doing that, as we see more content coming in, such that when we hit that done date and the developers say, okay, we need our translations now, we have a very small amount of new material that needs to be translated. And the last time we did this, we turned it around in 2 weeks, and that's in 30 plus languages. So when you figure in the amount of time to coordinate all those different linguists, 2 weeks is phenomenal compared to what we were doing before. And so moving on to the second problem, the second issue that we had was that translations were low priority. And I'm a linguistics engineer, so I'm looking through the files and the data, the translations. I have a background in some of these languages, and I'm just sitting here pulling my hair out when I see what's going on in our translations. There's things that just don't make any sense. There's things that are translated incorrectly, and segmentation errors. There's a lot of different issues that come up. But when me as a linguistics engineer, I would try to go back to my management and explain the problems that I was seeing, it was just like the deer in the headlights. They really didn't understand, and I wasn't able to connect the problems I was seeing in my translations and my desire to fix this to the business priorities. And so the second problem that we were facing was, how do we actually get this data in front of the management so they have some sense of what's going on, and we can get this properly escalated and reviewed so that the resources that we need are assigned to our teams to be able to manage and do our job effectively. So we needed evidence of the problem, and the solution was to go out and collect and gather that evidence, create the data so that we could make our reports and escalate the priority. So we're going to do translation testing, right? However, the issue was, the first challenge we met was people said, we're already doing that. We're already testing translations. Like, oh, okay. So we went in there and we started looking at what teams were doing and talking with them. And, the testing that was being done wasn't always, it was being done by people who didn't have a linguistics background. So they weren't evaluating any of the translations from a linguistics or semantic perspective. They're looking at purely formal properties about whether or not it fits in the space provided, or whether or not it, it truncates, something like that. So a lot of the issues they were detecting and they were reporting were non-issues. They were reporting things that weren't actually defects as defects. And the opposite problem was they weren't reporting things that were defects. And then secondly, they weren't separating out any of the issues. So a lot of the issues we were seeing were due to missing internationalization testing performed on layouts, or missing testing done on the software itself. So if a string was hard-coded, it was assigned to the localization team. Remember, we're just translating the files that we get from developers. So these issues are being assigned to us, but they weren't for us to fix. These UX team needed to go back and update designs to accommodate the fact that string length changes, or software needed to go back and redesign the way that it's managing a specific text so that we can translate it. And the end result of all this sort of confusion and lack of triage was that it just wasn't making any impact on management. So we ran our own proof of concept pilot project where we got a small budget to be able to go and do our own testing the way that we thought it should be done. And we started off with 10 languages. We worked with one of our vehicle teams to identify 450 screens that were related to high touch, high traffic parts of the software that were basically tagged as crucial or critical. And we went through once in English and once in the target language to get screenshots that were aligned with each other. And then these were loaded up in front of a native speaker who had a tool to go through one by one and review the screens to make sure that our translation was not truncated, that it didn't have an overlap issue with a button, that there was no string concatenation happening that would result in, non-grammatical text in the target language. And then, of course, working with UI software strings, they tend to be very short and brief, and not always very descriptive. So there's a high context is very important. And we evaluated the translations using the on-screen context to make sure that they were suitable and appropriate for the users. Now, the results of that, sorry, I skipped to the next slide, but the results of that were, on average per language, we discovered 600 issues that we were able to identify and create a ticket for and get to the proper person before the software was released. And that's compared to before, for a specific release, on average, they would do the teams would produce maybe 20 issues for a given language that were prioritized for resolution before release. So the scale of what we were doing and we were able to accomplish was on an entirely different level compared to what the teams were doing before. And we were, in a sense, a victim of our own success because project managers responsible for release, when they heard that there were 600 issues per language, they said, yes, you only did 10 languages. We support 35. So it's not acceptable that we don't do this for the additional 25. And we didn't have any sort of framework. This was just a pilot project. So we were doing a lot of this, it hadn't been fully streamlined and automated, and it far exceeded our capacity to do this. And so in a sense, we got in this very sort of vulnerable position where we had identified there was a huge problem, but then the management needed to see that there was a plan in place and a solution, that we had the know-how and we could rally the resources to manage these issues. So they really asked themselves a question: as a company, do we have any clue like how to translate if this much stuff is getting into our software? And so luckily, because of the position we were in, we were also able to advise them and say, hey, we have a way to manage this. But it was a big, I hope I'm expressing the scope and the size of the issue that was in front of us with the limited amount of resources that we had in terms of people. And so managing that communication and being able to express that in a clear, concise way for people who are not, they're business people, they're not linguistics people, was very crucial. And I'll let Todd talk a little bit about, how we worked with Lingoport on that piece of the equation.
Yeah. So thanks, Brandon. And the whole testing thing that Brandon did was a great way to expose the problem. But then the next question is, well, then what are the solutions to that problem, right? So they hired us to do a process audit, and that was a fairly involved process to make sure we were understanding how people were doing things, what they were doing, and what were the root causes. What were the actual, as opposed to the symptoms, what are the root causes? And the first, we did a process scorecard for that. You can see over there on the right. That's a scorecard of the various things that we felt were important to go through. Management really liked what we presented from that standpoint, and getting their attention in the first place was a huge success. And then showing them how to fix it was a second success. But the number one thing, if you take away from this, is moving upstream. So many of the problems that Brandon was catching were really being caught way too late in the process. And so the further upstream you can go, and the further upstream you can go to fix the problems, the less problems you have, the less tracking of problems you have, and the less duplication or replication of problems that you have. So, for example, a concatenated string, it might show up in as an issue in 15 of your locales. Well, that's 15 bug tickets that all get tracked, but it's one issue, it's one problem. So that whole tracking and all that, if you go downstream, it creates its own little nightmare for you. So moving upstream was the main thing, both in terms of testing, in terms of design, and then in terms of just acknowledgement of translation requirements. So making sure that each of the groups have translation as a key requirement, as a definition of done in what they're doing. That's also really huge, because then they pause and think about, oh, how's this impact translation? So that's another key piece. Back over to you, Brandon.
Yeah. So, I mentioned earlier that there were all these different teams involved, whether or not management or your company is working with all those teams on translation issues, is one thing. But what this allowed us to do was we actually called out that the root cause of a lot of these errors that we were seeing in translations were actually generated by other like upstream in the process. Localizations tends to sit downstream in the process, at least it does at our company. And so just calling out that translations team doesn't own it's every single error that is seen on a screen when you switch to another language, that we have a specific scope of work and that the translation scope of work is actually partly belongs with other teams. Getting that in front of the management was really, important, just to being able to define to the management what it is that we're able to do and making sure that, the resources and people, whether it's your localizations team or an internationalization team who's going and working with them, or if they tell you, okay, thank you for telling us about the problem, we can take care of this ourselves. It still needs to be identified and it needs to be understood, as a part of the production process, that not everything is a translations issue. Some of this stuff you have to go back upstream in your process and implement solutions there in order to eliminate the issue at the root cause. So that was really great. It took a lot off my plate, and truly Lingoport did a phenomenal job at speaking with all the different stakeholders, getting a sort of consensus view around translations and how it's priority within the company, and then being able to present that to the management. So it really helped us to establish and maintain our credibility in front of an audience that can be difficult to communicate with at times. So here's kind of the lessons learned. The early success, it was very important to show management what we were capable of doing and show how these different way of thinking about testing was going to help drive improvements. And then, one thing that was really encouraging was the recognition of seeing, there was a desire to move more of the testing work into my workflow, which, was a recognition that the way I was testing, our team was testing translations, was doing something different that needed to be scaled up to other teams. So that was really huge for us. And we were able to do that through generating this data, generating these test cases, and being able to get this appropriate level of communication with management. We did, we talked about developers, and at first we talked about how there can be pushback from people say, well, we've always done it this way. Why do we need to change? And, that's always a part of the process. But as you continue to advance and show people the benefits of what you're doing, we do see that developers come on board. And, I think there's a relief there that they no longer have to manage this. It's less for them to have to do. Our vice president is one of our advocates, and she sits, it's nice to know that the person when we report up to, when translations comes up as a topic of conversation at the senior levels of the company, we do have somebody on our side who's, she's familiar with the issues and she advocates for us. And, that's really helpful as well. So making sure that you've got somebody who can advocate for you. And, we're expanding the same testing, like I said, to all of our major vehicles and locales. More teams are coming into the process. So every week I have a new team that says, hey, we heard about what you're doing for Team X or Team Y, and we think that's great. We'd love to be a part of it too. And so we've got approximately 100 different software repos in there now, and we continue to grow. And that is, again, recognition that we're doing something here that's an improvement on what people were doing before. We see translation starting sooner, testing starting sooner. Some of the testing is moving upstream. Our UX team is doing internationalization testing before they hand off, and that helps eliminate issues at the source. And overall, our team is still very lean. So it was me and one other person. We recently hired a third person, but we're still not like a 20-person team. It's a very small team of 3 that is managing this issue for the entire group. So that is how we stay small but mighty. I think I'll hand over to you guys for questions.
Yeah, we'll let Adam kind of gets run through the questions if there are any. Hopefully we got some questions from the audience.
Not yet, but I'm gonna just mention again the webinar that we'll be having in December. The registration page is already up. We're planning ahead. Just go to lingoport.com and go to resources and pull down to webinars. That's going to be with Georg L. from Phrase. He's the CEO of Phrase. Marco Trombetti, CEO of Translated, as well as Luz Pineda. All right. All right. So we don't see any questions yet, which kind of surprises me. People here as well as over at LinkedIn Live can ask questions. Kate is monitoring LinkedIn Live. I have one that comes up a lot, and it's for Brandon. Not on a technical basis, but on sort of like a momentum basis. When you went back to teams and said, hey, this needs to be redone, did you get a lot of pushback regarding the balance of new features or whatever was on their plan versus going back to what they considered something that was done already and fixing it for localization? Did you get any resistance there from the developer teams? And if you did, how did you handle it?
Yeah, so there's kind of two. The answer is yes. We did get pushback from the developers. Most of the time, the way developers want to handle these issues is a defect is created and then it sits in a backlog and they can kind of get to it whenever, it's convenient for them. The other situation is where we look for these issues before we translate, with the idea that it will lead to better translations and better quality, less defects. And we have received quite a bit of pushback from that because then it puts them in the critical path. So basically we say we can't translate until you fix this stuff. That's a harder one to manage, but what we've seen is we do get a tremendous amount of pushback, but we explain our position and why we're doing this, and they understand. I think it's mainly due to a lot of anxiety and pressure around deadlines and keeping things on track. Nobody wants to see the release go off track due to a translations issue. So it's especially difficult at first, but what we've seen is the teams come and because they know we're going to have this type of input, they come to us earlier. And so it's difficult conversation to have, but the outcome of that is they adapt and they come earlier and they ask for your input earlier so that it's not a high pressure situation, the day you're supposed to send it to the translation company.
Yep. One of the things that we've seen over time is that when Localyzer even just flags a simple thing like they missed a key or something like that, sometimes there can be pushback from the developers, but once that goes through a cycle or two, behavior gets a lot better. But anyway, I want to get to, we have a question here. How was the approach to the translator agencies? Did you adapt to the way they were working, what cat tools they use or memory update constant, or they adapted to how you were working? Do you need me to, there's a lot in that question. Do you need me to reread that? Okay.
So how do we bring the translation company on board into the process? So the way that we did it was, they have seats at the table, right? So most translation companies, when they support a customer such as CNH, they will use a number of different translation systems to meet the requirements of their customer. So in this case, we asked our vendors to support XTM Cloud. So from being a consumer of language services, this put us in a better position because when when the translation company manages all of the translation memories, then us as a customer, if we want to leverage our translation data, it's stipulated in our contracts that we own the linguistic assets, but we're basically locked into going through a single supplier, which that's not even always to the supplier's benefit, because if the supplier has capacity issues or even expertise, like, we're locked into using that supplier. And so that puts a lot of pressure on a single supplier to be able to deliver for all of a customer's needs. By having our linguistic assets internally, then, it's not a big deal. We can assign the work to whoever we want because it's already been leveraged before it gets sent out. So basically our suppliers have access to XTM. They can come in, they can actually, we assign everything to them within the tool. We don't actually stipulate that they have to work in, we say you have to upload the files into the tool when you're done, but there are options. For example, if an LSP has a preferred tool or process, they can take our XLIF files offline, work on it using their workflows, and then upload the files at the end of the process. And so it keeps everything aligned. We're happy because the changes we're spending so much time and effort and money to get into our software, those are there for all of our different suppliers. And the translation company doesn't have to worry about breaking our software.
All right, very good. We have a second follow-up question here. Thank you, Brandon. Question for Brandon. How long does the ICR, I guess that's in context review process, usually take? And is the review performed on a centralized platform? Thank you.
So yes, the in-context review process. So once we hand it over to the supplier who does the review, they can turn things around in a week or two. It actually, they're very, very quick. Some of the things, but being able to do that requires a lot of good prep work. So we've got teams who have, they have a test bench, they have our software loaded on it. And those teams write automation scripts to crawl through the software and grab the screens that we need. So all that work is kind of done as prep work. And then once we upload the translations, like the first pass, we upload that, we make a software build, we hand it to a test team who then runs those scripts. It takes them a few days to generate the screenshots. We get those over to our supplier. The supplier has a proprietary platform for aligning and uploading the screenshots, and then reviewers just go through that. They just cycle through the screens, and there's a way that they can there's a way that they can note exactly what changes they want to make. And then we built an integration, an automation that routes the changes coming from that platform directly back into our translation memory. And so we hand the screenshots over to the supplier, the reviewers go through it, and we get everything back into the software. It's a 2 to 3 week process, and then usually our devs need like a week to review the changes and include them in the software.
So is there also maybe an in-country review by a native speaker?
We use native, yes, we have in-country reviewers who are inside of CNH for some of the languages, but not for all. So we do 35 languages, and we have in-country reviewers for maybe 2 or 3 languages. So we're using a native speaker that first time through to go through, and then yes, we would deliver the software after we've gone through this process. It's handed over to in-country teams, and it's available for in-country teams to go through and identify, identify any additional issues that they feel we didn't address, and then we manage those as defects.
Shameless plug. Also, Lingoport has in-context review solutions that integrate with the repos as well. And you can see that on our product pages if you scroll down. Anyway, any other questions? I think that about
Adam,
does
there
it.
is There is one in the chat. It's from LinkedIn. I just posted it there. Can you please take it?
Okay, sure.
Mhm.
Question from LinkedIn. Test is in from LinkedIn. Test is including functional tests or just a UI check?
I mean, so I'm not. We're using just static screenshots, and then we have some basic knowledge, for example, if we see there's a truncation, somebody might come back and we'll assign it to a software team. We'll say, there's a scroll feature, right? So we're using just static screenshots to make sure that the translations are correct. We are not sending some sort of simulator to a tester to review that, to click through it and then give us feedback. Mainly because we have to install, if it was like a web page or something, it might be easier because web technology is, very standardized and consistent, but these are embedded devices. And so it needs a specific, hardware setup in order to get it to run. It requires a lot of, simulating all the different tools that can connect to a tractor or sprayer, and getting that to show on the screen is quite a daunting task. And so the easiest way for us to control the environment is just to have an internal testing team generate those cases, take screenshots, and then move those resources to a native speaker who can tell us whether or not the language is correct.
Well, along those lines, how about pseudo localizing and having your functional testers, kind of go through things?
That is on the list of things that we want to do. So we
Yeah.
don't do it today. That normally gets detected very far downstream, maybe years after we've released a product where a customer overseas in a different market will, have the product try to use a feature and say, hey, this isn't working. And then we'll get a defect report about it. So obviously that's not the way we'd like to conduct business. We'd like to detect it up front. One of the common issues is character encodings, especially across systems that have to send and receive information. So if you're exporting data from one environment and importing it to another environment, that requires teams to actually follow like standards for how you encode characters. And one thing that's been surprising to me is that a lot of engineers don't always conform to standards. They just evaluate the output. They go, it works. And I looked at it in English, but then, we have issues because that way that they were handling character encoding falls apart when you try to switch the language. So, yeah.
Brandon's team is implementing Globalizer now. That'll catch a lot of that stuff. Additionally, as they can implement, Localizer has a feature where pseudo localization can be always on. So assuming your testers in line, you can always be testing for functional compliance. But he's traveled a pretty fast road over the last year. I've gotten to watch at a distance, Todd a lot closer up, working with Brandon and our technical team. That seems to be it for questions, unless there's something else.
Real quick, actually, before you go there, just a comment on what Brandon just said on the testing side is that whole loopback thing that he talked about. One of the features of Localizer that it takes advantage of is that Localizer knows where all the strings are. And so that helps facilitate that process of making sure you're correcting the right string when you make a correction.
Yeah. So the important part to getting it from one part, like routing it, is you have to have a tracking system. And that tracking system is kind of out of the box available with Localizer. And so once we understood that that's what we needed to be using, I had a conversation with Todd and with Olivier from Lingoport, and they go, yeah, we have that. We already set it up. And I'm like, oh, so it was just, I had to flip a switch and there it was, right? So that's a tremendously useful feature, especially if you've got this distributed teams that are all trying to give you feedback on different, text, and, you've got we've got more than 10 teams working on the software that goes onto our vehicles. And so when something shows up, you've got to know which one of those 10 teams that it goes back to. And it's not a trivial task. Like it's very difficult engineering problem that Lingoport's already kind of set up inside of Localyzer that will help you tremendously for managing all of that information and inside of a distributed software environment.
All right, good answer.
So, sorry, I just have a quick clarification from the same person who asked about the functional tests. She asked, so any language did not run any functional test except English? So this is the question.
So I would say we run functional testing. I mean, in a sense, if you think about it, we have to switch the language and run through all the screens. So we know that it's working because we visualize the stuff on a screen. We have people also who maybe they don't grab all the screenshots, but they go through everything in the software to make sure that the files don't cause the software to crash. So we do this level of testing to make sure that, nothing coming from translations team is going to cause the software to fail. So that's what we're doing. But of course, there's always going to be features that people add in. And again, the point is the import export, because you're writing out data that's going to be consumed by maybe another software tool. And so it kind of is one of those things, well, it's outside of scope because I'm not going to test to see if somebody else's stuff can import my files correctly or import my stuff correctly. I'm only considering my specific sort of silo software, does it work? Does it fail? So there's some things that fall through the cracks. But we do actually go through the software and test that, everything actually loads, that it's not going to cause like a catastrophic system failure due to a localization file.
To whoever asked that question, if they search the Lingoport blog on pseudo localization, you'll find quite a bit there that enables, the point of it is to enable somebody who may not speak a target language to be able to functionally test. So you can get your QA team that's in-house without actually having to have a translator or in-house go through the screens and just at least make sure that nothing's going to break without necessarily, if suddenly the person who's never learned Japanese has to load in Japanese, they can't even navigate through the application unless they know it by heart. So the idea is to simulate what that person what would be encountered in other languages, while be able to functionally test with English in the center of the pseudo localized string. We have, I think this has to be our last question here because we're running out of time, but do you have a team of in-house translators to do the linguistic testings? Okay, that's sort of the same thing we just answered.
Yeah. So no, we use suppliers primarily. And I mean, you would think that a company well, let's put it this way. Terminology is a sore point for us that we haven't really fully wrapped our arms around yet. And so that's, and in a big distributed group like this, that's hard because you've got marketing teams that have different deadlines and priorities that are translating content. There's operators manuals, and then there's the software teams. And so, terminology management is how we're engaging our internal linguistic experts. I tend to work mainly with engineering people, which, everybody has their strengths and weaknesses. And there's people who have linguistics, language backgrounds, and there's people who have math, science, and engineering backgrounds. That's how it kind of gets split up in most places. And so the people with the math and engineering backgrounds, language isn't always what's considered acceptable for a language perspective is not going to be the same between those two groups. And so we decided that we would focus on terminology where our engineers are going to be very strong. We will document and notate that, and then we can share that with suppliers who will then have, the expertise and the knowledge they need to have to be able to do their job and give us the output that we want.
All right. Well, I'm gonna close off the questions at this point. I want to thank you, Brandon, for a very detailed presentation. Brandon and Todd also gave this at Loc-World, but we thought it was really strong and worth making a webinar out of because of the real life detail. And I know that your situation of being understaffed, given the large amount of enterprise work that comes through, is actually a common situation. We deal with companies that often have hundreds to even thousands of products. And so when you have that kind of scale, the airport analogy really is meaningful. I'm going to steal that from you, Brandon. So again, thank you very much. And thank you, Todd, for keeping this together and all that. Oh, we have a nice thank you from somebody here also in the chat. All right. Well, thank you very much again, and take care, everyone. There's nothing you have to do. The recording will be, link will be sent to you. Kate takes care of that. Thank you, Kate. And we'll see you next month. All right. Bye-bye. And happy Thanksgiving for those in the US celebrating. Take care.